The ballroom of the Whitfield Hotel glittered with the particular brightness reserved for events where everyone present had something to prove. Chandeliers throwing gold light across a sea of black tuxedos and gowns that cost more than most people's monthly salaries. And Elena Marchetti stood near the edge of the bar with a glass of sparkling water she had no intention of finishing, doing the math on how soon she could leave without it looking like an escape. The charity gala had been unavoidable, a professional obligation tied to the foundation she now consulted for, and she had chosen her dress with the kind of careful strategy that came from months of practice. A long emerald coat draped loose over a structured gown, enough fabric to soften the outline of 7 months of pregnancy without drawing the eye to ask why. She had become skilled, over the past several months, at managing exactly this kind of evening, learning which angles in a room kept her silhouette in shadow, which conversations she could exit gracefully before anyone looked too closely, which smiles bought her enough goodwill that people stopped looking at her at all. It was exhausting in a way she rarely admitted even to herself, this constant low hum of vigilance, but it had become necessary in a city where her name still carried enough weight that strangers felt entitled to comment on her life, and she had no intention of letting tonight's donors discover anything about her circumstances before she was ready to share it on her own terms. She had almost made it through the evening unnoticed, tucked into conversations about silent auction items and donor pledges, when she felt the air shift the way it sometimes did right before something bad happened. A prickling at the back of her neck that made her turn toward the entrance a half-second before she heard his voice. "Elena, is that actually you?" Bradley Coleman crossed the room with the easy, confident stride of a man who had never once doubted his welcome anywhere, a woman on his arm in a silver gown that caught the light with every step. Blonde hair swept into the kind of effortless style that took 2 hours and a stylist to achieve. Elena's stomach dropped, a sensation entirely unrelated to the baby shifting inside her, and she fixed her expression into the practiced neutrality she had spent 6 months perfecting for exactly this kind of ambush. "Bradley," she said, keeping her voice even. "I didn't know you'd be here. Caroline's family sponsors half the table," he said, gesturing vaguely at the woman beside him, who offered Elena a smile so polished it could have been manufactured. "Caroline Ashford. Elena and I go way back." The way he said it, breezy and dismissive, reduced 2 years of engagement and a shattered family into a footnote, and Elena felt the old anger flicker beneath her composure. Banked, but never fully extinguished. "Lovely to meet you," Caroline said, in a tone that suggested the opposite, her eyes sweeping over Elena with the quick, assessing once-over of a woman cataloging competition and finding none. Bradley's gaze, meanwhile, had drifted downward, taking in the loose drape of Elena's coat, the slight thickness at her middle that no amount of careful tailoring could fully disguise up close, and something cruel and satisfied flickered across his face, the particular pleasure of a man who believed he had finally found the upper hand in a conversation he had been losing for months. "Wow," he said, loud enough to carry, loud enough for the small cluster of mutual acquaintances drifting nearby to hear clearly. "You really let yourself go. Didn't you, I mean? Look at you. You got fat. Elena." The words landed in the air like something physical, and Elena felt heat rush up her neck, the particular humiliation of being mocked in public by a man who had once promised to spend his life loving her, now standing there with a smug, satisfied smile, utterly blind to the truth growing beneath her coat. A few heads turned nearby, the low murmur of conversation faltering as people registered the cruelty of the comment, and Caroline's smile sharpened into something almost gleeful. Delighted by her fiancé's casual dismantling of a woman she had clearly decided posed no threat, Elena opened her mouth, searching for something composed and devastating to say, something that would not give Bradley the satisfaction of seeing how deeply the words had cut. when her phone buzzed once in her clutch. A single message lighting the screen just enough for her to catch it. 5 minutes out. Stay where you are. Adrian. She held the small device, a beat longer than necessary, grateful for the excuse to look away from Bradley's smug, satisfied face, and felt the familiar steadiness that his name alone could bring her even from a distance. A kind of calm that had taken her months to learn to trust. Caroline, sensing the shift in Elena's expression and mistaking it for embarrassment rather than relief, pressed her advantage with the casual cruelty of someone who had never once had to fight for anything in her life. "It's all right," she said, in a tone that managed to sound sympathetic while landing as anything but. Some women just don't bounce back the way others do. "It's genetics. Mostly, I'm told." "Is it?" Elena said flatly, refusing to give the comment the reaction it was fishing for. Though the effort cost her more than she let show, she had no time to process the relief that flooded through her before the doors at the far end of the ballroom opened, and the entire room seemed to register the change before anyone announced it. A ripple of attention moving through the crowd the way it does when someone undeniably important enters a space. Adrian Volkov did not need to raise his voice or announce himself. He simply walked, tall and unhurried, dark suit cut with the kind of precision that made every other man in the room look slightly underdressed by comparison, and the crowd parted for him. The way water parts for something it instinctively understands it cannot stop. He crossed the room directly toward Elena, ignoring the small cluster of people who turned to greet him, his eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made the rest of the ballroom blur into irrelevance. When he reached her, he did not hesitate. He slid one arm around her waist, his hand settling with quiet, deliberate possession at the small of her back, and pressed a kiss to her temple in full view of Bradley, of Caroline, of the entire glittering, gossiping room. "Sorry I'm late," he said, his voice low, meant for her alone, even though everyone nearby could hear it. "Are you all right?" "I am now," Elena said, and meant it more than the simple words could carry. Bradley's face had gone through several expressions in the span of a few seconds, confusion sliding into recognition, sliding into something close to horror as understanding settled over him. The realization arriving all at once like a physical blow. He knew exactly who Adrian Volkov was. Everyone in this city with any sense knew exactly who Adrian Volkov was. The kind of man whose name was spoken carefully in certain rooms and not at all in others. The kind of man whose business interests touched real estate and shipping and a dozen other industries with a thoroughness that made most competitors quietly step aside rather than test him. And the way Adrian's hand rested against the curve of Elena's stomach now, gentle, but unmistakably claiming, told Bradley everything he had not understood a moment before he opened his mouth. "You're the father," Bradley said, the words coming out strangled, all his earlier confidence collapsing into something pale and uncertain. "I am," Adrian said, and his voice carried none of the warmth it had held for Elena a moment earlier, dropping instead into something flat and quiet that was somehow far more dangerous than shouting could have been. "Which means whatever you just said to her, in front of all these people, you said to my family. I'd think very carefully about whether you want to say anything else tonight." The threat was not loud. It did not need to be. Bradley's mouth opened and closed without producing a sound. And beside him, Caroline's manufactured smile had vanished entirely, replaced by the calculating stillness of a woman rapidly recalculating the political weight of the room she stood in. The small audience that had gathered to witness Bradley's earlier cruelty now watched something else entirely unfold. The quiet, absolute reversal of power. And Elena felt something in her chest loosen for the first time all evening. The humiliation of moments ago burning away under the steady weight of Adrian's hand against her back. "We're leaving," Adrian said, turning his attention fully back to Elena, all the coldness gone from his voice as quickly as it had appeared. replaced again by a gentleness reserved only for her. "You shouldn't be standing this long. Come on." He guided her toward the exit with unhurried care, his hand never leaving the small of her back, and Elena did not look behind her to see Bradley's face. Did not need to, because she could feel the weight of his stunned silence following them across the room like a physical thing. Only as they reached the doors did Adrian pause, glancing back over his shoulder at Bradley with an expression that needed no translation. A final, wordless promise that this conversation, whatever it had been, was very far from finished. Then the doors closed behind them, and the noise of the ballroom fell away, leaving only the quiet of the hallway, the steady warmth of Adrian's hand against her back, and the first easy breath Elena had managed to take all night. He guided her toward a private alcove near the coat check, slowing his pace to match hers without comment. And only once they were fully out of earshot of the ballroom did his expression soften into something less guarded, the cold composure he had worn for Bradley's benefit melting away into plain, unhidden concern. "He had no idea," Adrian said quietly, more statement than question, watching her face for the truth beneath whatever calm she might still be performing. "About any of it?" "No," Elena said, and let herself lean, just slightly, into the solid warmth of him, the adrenaline of the last few minutes finally beginning to drain out of her shoulders. "He never asked. He never really wanted to know anything about me that wasn't useful to him." She exhaled, the tightness in her chest easing for the first time since she had heard his voice across the room. "I'm glad you came when you did. I told you I would," Adrian said simply, as though it had never been in question, and reached for her coat to settle it more securely around her shoulders against the cold waiting for them outside. The car pulled away from the Whitfield Hotel in silence, the city sliding past the tinted windows in long ribbons of light, and Elena sat with her hands folded over the curve of her stomach, watching Adrian's profile in the dim glow of passing street lamps. He had not said much since they left the ballroom, his jaw still carrying the faint tension of a man holding back a great deal more than he had shown Bradley, and she recognized the particular stillness in him now, the controlled quiet that meant he was thinking through several moves at once, the way he always did before deciding which one to make. She let the silence stretch a while longer, watching the way his hands rested on his knee, perfectly still, the kind of stillness that came from years of training a body not to betray what a mind was doing. She had learned, over the months they had known each other, to read the shape of his quiet the same way other people read facial expressions. The small distinctions between the silence that meant he was working through a problem and the silence that meant he simply wanted to sit beside her without needing to fill the space with words. Tonight's silence was the first kind, heavier than usual, and she suspected it had less to do with Bradley than with something further back, something the evening had only managed to unearth. "You don't have to handle it tonight," she said finally, breaking the silence. "Whatever you're planning to do about him, it can wait." "I'm not planning anything tonight," Adrian said, though the flatness in his voice suggested he had already considered several options and discarded most of them as too immediate. He glanced over at her, something in his expression shifting toward the gentler version of himself he rarely showed anyone but her. "I'm more interested in how you're doing. He's said things like that to you before, hasn't he? Not just tonight." Elena exhaled slowly, surprised, as she so often was with Adrian, by how easily he read the things she did not say out loud. "Toward the end, yes. Not about my weight, about my father's company, about how I should have seen the collapse coming, about how naive I'd been to think love was supposed to survive a bad financial quarter." She looked out the window, the old grief settling back over her familiar and dull, worn smooth by months of carrying it. "My father had a stroke 6 weeks after Bradley pulled his investment out of the company. The doctors never said it was connected. Not officially, but I've never been able to separate the two in my head. He worked himself into the ground, trying to save something that was already lost. And Bradley walked away clean. And I keep wondering if I'd never brought him into my father's life at all. Maybe none of it would have happened the way it did. That's not something you carry, Adrian said quietly, his hand finding hers across the seat, his thumb moving in a slow, steady line over her knuckles. He made his own choice. Men like that always find a way to protect themselves first and call it practical. You didn't put that decision in his hands. He took it. I know that, Elena said. Most days I even believe it. She turned her hand over beneath his, lacing their fingers together, grateful for the simple, unhurried warmth of the gesture. Tell me something. Why did you stay back so long tonight? After I texted you where I was, you said 5 minutes, but it felt longer. Adrian was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the road ahead, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped into something lower, more careful. The register he used when he was about to hand her a piece of himself he did not often share. I was watching the room before I came in. Old habit. I needed to know who else was there, what kind of exit you'd need if things went badly, whether Coleman had anyone with him who might cause a real problem rather than just an embarrassing scene. He paused. It's not paranoia. Not exactly. It's the only way I know how to walk into a room when someone I care about is already inside it. Where does that come from? Elena asked gently, sensing the door he had cracked open, unwilling to let it close again without understanding what was behind it. Adrian's hand tightened briefly around hers before relaxing again, a small, involuntary motion that told her more than his expression did. I was 22 when my mother died, he said. There was a dispute, the kind that happens in my world more often than anyone outside it would believe. 2 factions arguing over territory that didn't belong to either of them by any right that mattered. My father thought he had it handled. He was wrong. She was at a restaurant with friends when it happened, nowhere near the actual conflict, completely unconnected to any of it, except that she carried his name, and that was reason enough for someone to make a point. His voice stayed level, the practiced evenness of a story told many times in his own head and rarely out loud. I was the one who identified her. My father never fully recovered from it. Not really. And I made myself a promise standing in that morgue that I would never again let someone I loved become collateral in a war that had nothing to do with them. I would rather be too careful than be the man who has to walk into another room like that one. Elena reached over and laid her free hand against his jaw, turning his face gently toward hers, wanting him to see that she had heard him. Not just the words, but the years of grief folded carefully underneath them. You were a child, she said softly. 22 is barely grown. You shouldn't have had to carry something like that alone. And you shouldn't still be carrying it the way you are now, as though it's the only thing that can ever happen to the people you love. Maybe not, Adrian said, but I've never found a way to fully believe otherwise. My father tried. After, he surrounded himself with more security than any one man could ever need, and it still wasn't enough to protect what mattered most. Because the threat came from somewhere he wasn't watching. I learned from his mistake. You don't watch the obvious door. You watch all of them, all the time. Even the ones that seem harmless. Elena absorbed the weight of it in silence for a moment, understanding now, with a clarity that softened the frustration she had not even realized she was carrying, why he had kept a certain careful distance through most of her pregnancy, present but never quite fully present, generous but never quite unguarded. That's why you've kept things so quiet, she said. Why you haven't wanted anyone to know about us until tonight. I wanted to control when and how the world found out. He admitted, not because I was ashamed of you. Not for a single second, because the moment people know you matter to me, you become a target in ways you can't fully understand from the outside. I needed time to put protections in place first. I should have explained that to you instead of just disappearing into logistics and leaving you to wonder. You should have, Elena agreed, though there was no real anger in it, only the quiet relief of finally understanding a silence that had unsettled her more than she had admitted even to herself. I thought, some nights, that you were keeping your distance because the pregnancy made things complicated, because I wasn't as useful to you anymore. Now that my father's company is gone, and there's nothing left to gain from the Marchetti name, Adrian's expression shifted into something sharper, almost wounded. Is that really what you thought of me? It's what fear does, Elena said honestly. It finds the worst possible explanation and convinces you it's the only one available. He brought her hand to his lips then, pressing a slow kiss against her knuckles, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that left no room for doubt. There has never been a version of this where you weren't enough on your own, he said. Everything I've built, everything I protect, none of it means anything if it isn't keeping you and our son safe. That's the only ledger I'm keeping anymore. The car slowed as it approached the private entrance of his estate, security gates parting smoothly at their approach, and as they pulled through, Adrian's phone buzzed once against the console, a brief message from his head of security that he read with a small, decisive nod before setting the phone aside. I'm having the detail around you increased, he said, almost as an afterthought, already moving past the subject as though it required no further discussion. Starting tomorrow, a second car on you whenever you leave the estate, an extra man stationed near your office. Coleman knows now. I'd rather be cautious than sorry. Adrian. Elena's voice carried a note of hesitation she did not fully examine in the moment, the beginning of an objection she did not yet have the words to finish. Distracted by the warmth of his hand still wrapped around hers and the exhaustion of the long evening settling heavily over her, we should talk about that, together. Before you decide, we will, he said, the words smooth and reassuring, though something in his tone suggested the decision, in his mind, had already been made, regardless of what the conversation might produce. He helped her from the car, one arm steady beneath hers as they walked toward the warmly lit entrance of the house. And if Elena noticed the small, unspoken finality in his voice, she let it go for tonight. Too tired and too grateful for the quiet safety of his arm to press the matter any further. Inside, the house had gone still for the night. Only a single lamp left burning in the front hall by the housekeeper, who had long since learned their late return habits. Adrian guided her toward the staircase, and at the landing he paused, turning her gently to face him, his expression softer now than it had been at any point since they left the gala. Thank you for trusting me with tonight, he said, and with everything before it. I know it hasn't always been easy. The waiting, the secrecy. I'm asking you to be patient with me a little longer, while I make sure the world around our son is one he never has to be afraid of. I trust you, Elena said, and meant it, even as a small, unexamined part of her wondered exactly how far that trust would be tested before either of them learned where its limits actually lay. The new security detail arrived exactly as promised the following morning, a black sedan parked discreetly at the end of the estate's private drive, a second car trailing Elena's at a careful distance the moment she left for the city, and a man she did not recognize stationed near the entrance of the small office building where she met with the foundation's board twice a week. By the third day, the careful, constant presence of strangers tracking her, every movement had stopped feeling like protection and started feeling like a cage with very polite bars. And Elena found herself increasingly desperate for even a single hour that belonged entirely to her. She tried, at first, to simply accept it, telling herself that Adrian's caution came from love rather than control, that the men stationed at quiet distances around her life existed only to keep her and the baby safe. But the accumulation wore on her in small, constant ways she had not anticipated. The way a barista now recognized the man who waited near the cafe door every morning. The way her assistant had started routing her schedule through a separate security channel without asking Elena first. The way even a simple walk to clear her head now came with an invisible shadow she had not chosen and could not shake. She missed, more than she expected to, the particular freedom of moving through the world unnoticed, a freedom she had taken entirely for granted before any of this began. She used the appointment with her father's estate lawyer as her excuse, a legitimate piece of unfinished business that had been sitting untouched on her desk for weeks. The final paperwork required to close out the last threads of Marchetti logistics before the company's name disappeared from the city's business registry for good. She told the driver assigned to her that morning that she needed an hour alone in the building, citing privacy around sensitive family documents, and to her quiet relief he agreed to wait outside rather than accompany her in, though she suspected Adrian would have a great deal to say about that particular allowance later. The lawyer's office sat 3 floors above a small corner cafe her father had frequented for decades, the kind of place that had survived the neighborhood's slow gentrification through sheer, stubborn loyalty from its regulars. And after the meeting concluded, weighed down by the particular grief of signing the last documents that formally erased her father's life's work from existence, Elena found herself drawn downstairs into the cafe rather than back out to the waiting car. She ordered tea she did not really want and took a small table near the back, needing a few private minutes to compose herself before facing the watchful eyes waiting for her outside. It was the voice through the thin partition wall separating her table from the small private booth behind it that caught her attention, familiar in a way that made her spine stiffen before her mind had fully registered why. Bradley's voice, low and tense, clearly believing himself unheard by anyone who mattered. "I told you, it's handled," he was saying, his tone carrying the particular strain of a man trying to sound more confident than he felt. The gala was a setback, I'll admit that, but it doesn't change the fundamentals of what we discussed. Volkov has interests that overlap with your family's portfolio in 3 different developments. He's not going to risk a public mess over something as small as an old engagement. There was a pause, presumably while whoever sat across from him responded, and Elena went very still, her tea forgotten, every instinct telling her to leave immediately, and every other instinct keeping her rooted exactly where she was. "With respect, Mr. Ashford, I understand the risk," Bradley continued, "but consider the leverage. If word got out that Volkov's child is being carried by a woman with no public connection to him until 2 nights ago, the scrutiny alone could complicate 3 of his active negotiations. I'm not suggesting we threaten him directly. I'm suggesting we let him understand that staying cooperative on the Bellwether parcel keeps certain inconvenient stories quiet a while longer. Caroline agrees this is the cleanest path forward for both families." Elena's stomach turned, ice spreading through her chest as the pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The casual cruelty at the gala suddenly recontextualized as something far more calculated than a wounded ego lashing out. This had never been about Bradley simply being cruel in the moment. It had been reconnaissance, the cruelty itself, perhaps incidental, a side effect of a man under enormous financial pressure, testing how much damage he could inflict, how much leverage her circumstances might be worth to people desperate enough to use a baby as a bargaining chip. She set down enough cash to cover her tea with hands that were not quite steady and left through the side door of the cafe rather than risk passing the booth where Bradley sat, her mind racing through a dozen different responses at once, each one discarded as quickly as it arrived. She knew, with absolute certainty, what Adrian would do with this information if she told him immediately, and some old, stubborn instinct in her, the same instinct that had once tried to handle her father's financial collapse alone rather than ask anyone for help, told her that calling him now would mean watching him handle Bradley with the kind of finality that left no room for half measures. She did not want that. Not yet. Not until she had at least tried, herself, to make Bradley understand the foolishness of what he was attempting. She found him 20 minutes later in the lobby of his own office building 2 blocks away, having tracked his usual schedule from memory of their years together, and approached him with a calm she did not entirely feel, catching him just as he stepped away from the elevator bank, his expression flickering through surprise and then wariness at the sight of her, standing there without an entourage of security visible nearby. "We need to talk," Elena said, privately. Bradley's eyes darted toward the building's entrance, some old habit of caution surfacing despite himself, and he guided her toward a quiet corner of the lobby with visible reluctance. "Elena, this isn't a good idea. If Volkov's people see you here with me, after the other night, I don't think either of us wants to deal with the fallout." "I heard you," Elena said, cutting through his deflection without preamble. "At the cafe. Your conversation with Caroline's father, the bellwether parcel, the leverage, all of it." She watched the color drain slowly from his face as understanding dawned, his composure cracking in real time. "You're going to use my pregnancy, our child, as a bargaining chip in a business deal. After everything, Bradley, that's actually what you've decided to become." "It's not what it sounds like," he said quickly, too quickly, the protest already sounding hollow even to his own ears. "I'm desperate. Elena, the company is 2 months from collapse. My father will lose everything he built, and Caroline's family is the only lifeline left. I wasn't going to actually do anything. I just needed leverage in the negotiation, something to make Volkov take the conversation seriously. You were going to threaten a man like Adrian Volkov with exposing his unborn child to the press," Elena said, her voice low and shaking with a fury she had not let herself feel until this exact moment. "To save your own company. The same way you abandoned my father's company the moment it stopped being convenient to you. Do you understand what kind of man you're talking about threatening? Do you have any idea what happens to people who try to use leverage against him?" "I didn't think it would actually come to that," Bradley said, his voice dropping into something closer to genuine fear now. The careful composure he had walked in with entirely gone. "I just needed something, anything, to bring to the table. Caroline's father doesn't move on a deal without seeing weakness in the other side first, and you were the only weakness I had left to offer him. I know how that sounds. I know exactly how that sounds. Saying it out loud to you." Bradley's bravado faltered visibly, real fear finally surfacing beneath the desperate calculation. "Is that a threat?" "No," Elena said. "It's a warning, and it's more than you deserve. Walk away from this. Whatever deal you think you can force, whatever leverage you imagine you have, it isn't worth what it will cost you." She turned to leave, her heart hammering, only to find the lobby's revolving door already turning. 2 familiar figures stepping through it with the unhurried, deliberate calm of men who had been tracking her location far more closely than she had realized. Adrian's security detail, the very men she had left outside the lawyer's office, crossed the lobby toward her with quiet efficiency, and behind them, a third figure she recognized immediately as Adrian's head of security, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes sharp with the particular tension of a man who had clearly already reported this exact location to someone waiting for the information. Elena felt relief and fury collide in her chest in equal measure, grateful not to be facing Bradley entirely alone, and furious to discover, in the same breath, exactly how thoroughly she had been watched without her knowledge, even on a morning she had believed, however briefly, to be hers alone. Bradley took an instinctive step backward at the sight of them, all his earlier bravado collapsing into something close to panic. the color draining further from his face as he registered exactly whose men had just walked into the lobby. "I wasn't doing anything," he said, the words tumbling out fast, directed less at Elena now than at the men approaching them. "We were just talking. That's all this was. That's not for you to decide," the head of security said evenly, his attention not on Bradley at all, but on Elena, his voice carrying the particular calm of a man trained never to escalate a situation in public. "Ms. Marchetti, the car is outside. Mr. Volkov has been notified you're here." Elena's stomach dropped at that, the realization landing with a fresh wave of frustration layered over the fear she had already been carrying. There would be no quiet way to handle this now. No private conversation. She could finish on her own terms before Adrian learned of it second-hand through a report rather than from her. She allowed herself to be guided toward the car, glancing back once at Bradley, who stood frozen in the lobby with the particular stillness of a man finally understanding the size of the mistake he had made, and said nothing further, letting her silence carry whatever warning her words had not already delivered. Adrian was waiting in the foyer of the estate when the car pulled in, standing perfectly still, with his hands clasped behind his back in a posture Elena had come to recognize as the one he wore when he was holding himself rigidly in check. And the moment she stepped through the door, his composure cracked just enough to let the worry beneath it show. She could see, in the set of his shoulders and the tightness around his eyes, that the report from his security team had reached him well before she had, and that whatever calm he was wearing now had been assembled deliberately, piece by piece, in the time it took her to make the drive home. "You went to see him," he said, before she had even fully crossed the threshold, his voice carrying none of the gentleness from the night before. "Alone, after everything that happened at the gala. You walked into his building without telling anyone. Without telling me. I had a reason," Elena said, matching his tone, refusing to let herself shrink under the weight of his anger, even though she understood, somewhere beneath her own frustration, that it came from fear rather than cruelty. "I overheard him on a phone call. He's planning to use our son as leverage in a business deal with Caroline's father. Something about a property called the Bellwether Parcel. I went to warn him off before things escalated. You should have called me the moment you heard that," Adrian said, his voice dropping into something low and hard. "Instead, you confronted him yourself, in a public lobby, without any protection beyond the men I had stationed there specifically because I anticipated exactly this kind of risk. I didn't want you to handle it the way you handle things," Elena said, the words coming out sharper than she intended, all the pent-up frustration of the past several days finally surfacing at once. "I wanted to give him one chance to walk away on his own before you made that decision for him in whatever permanent way you make those decisions. Is that really so impossible to understand?" "What's impossible to understand," Adrian said, stepping closer, "is why you would walk into a room with a man desperate enough to threaten my unborn child for leverage, completely alone, rather than trust me enough to handle it the way I've handled every other threat against you for the last 6 months. Because that's exactly the problem," Elena said, her voice rising now, the words she had been holding back for days finally breaking loose. "You don't ask, Adrian. You don't discuss. You don't consult. You simply decide, and then you execute the decision. And you expect me to fall in line because you've convinced yourself it's all done out of love. Do you have any idea what that feels like? From where I'm standing, do you understand that I have lived this exact dynamic before, with a different man, for entirely different reasons, and it nearly broke me?" Adrian went very still, something in his expression shifting from anger into something closer to genuine alarm. "I am nothing like him. I know that," Elena said, softer now, though the urgency in her voice did not fade. "I know your reasons come from love and not contempt. I know you would burn the world down to keep me and our son safe. And some days that terrifies me less than it should. But the result, Adrian, the actual lived experience of it, feels the same either way. A car appears wherever I go without me asking for it. A man stands outside my office without me being told his name. My assistant reroutes my schedule through a security channel I never approved. I am being protected so thoroughly that I no longer recognize the shape of my own life. And nobody asked me first whether that's the kind of protection I actually want. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Elena began to wonder if she had pushed too far. The old fear of being too much, too demanding, too difficult, surfacing despite every effort she had made over the last several months to silence it. But when Adrian finally spoke, his voice had lost its hard edge entirely, replaced by something raw and unguarded that she had rarely heard from him before. My mother used to tell my father the same thing, he said quietly, that his protection had started to feel like a cage long before anyone actually came for her. He never listened. He told himself the same thing I've been telling myself, that love justified the control, that anyone who truly understood the danger would simply accept it without complaint. He looked away, his jaw tightening. I swore I would never become him. And somehow, without realizing it, I've spent the last week doing exactly what he did, deciding for you instead of with you, and calling it protection because the alternative, admitting that I'm just as afraid as he was, felt like too much weakness to show you. You're allowed to be afraid, Elena said, crossing the remaining distance between them, reaching for his hand. I am too, every single day. But fear can't be the thing that decides for both of us. If we're going to do this, raise this child together, build whatever life is actually possible for people like us, it has to be a partnership, not a fortress, with me locked safely inside it, while you stand guard outside the walls. A fortress, Adrian repeated, the word seeming to land harder than she had expected. His gaze dropping briefly to their joined hands. That's exactly what it became, isn't it? I told myself I was building something to keep you safe, and instead, I built the very thing my mother warned my father about, right down to the part where the person inside it stopped being asked what she actually needed. You're not your father, Elena said gently, but you can still learn from his mistake without having to repeat it first to understand it. Adrian's hand tightened around hers, and for a long moment he said nothing, the weight of the realization settling visibly over him. You're right, he said finally. I'll pull back the detail to something reasonable, something we agree on together. No more decisions made without you in the room. I should have known better than to repeat the one pattern I swore I'd never carry forward. Before Elena could respond, his phone buzzed sharply against the table near the door, and the brief flash of relief on his face shifted instantly into focus as he read the message, his expression hardening in a way that told her this was not a minor update. It's Marcus, he said, naming his head of security. He's confirmed everything you overheard. Caroline knew about the plan from the beginning. She's the one who suggested using the child as leverage in the first place, not Bradley. Her father is already drafting terms based on the assumption that the threat will be enough to move me on bellwether. They actually thought that would work, Elena said, equal parts disbelief and disgust, shaking her head slowly. They thought you would simply hand over a piece of property worth tens of millions of dollars because they hinted at a story that might embarrass us for a news cycle. They don't understand the first thing about who you actually are, do they? No, Adrian said, something grim and almost amused flickering across his expression, and by next week, they're going to understand it very clearly. They thought wrong, Adrian said, and something in his voice had shifted now into the controlled, deliberate calm of a man assembling a plan rather than reacting to a threat. There's a gala next week, the annual benefit the Ashford family hosts every year for half the city's old money. Bradley and Caroline will both be there, surrounded by exactly the kind of audience that matters most to people like them. I think it's time we ended this properly, together, in front of everyone who needs to see it end. What exactly does ending it properly look like to you? Elena asked, watching him carefully, aware that the answer mattered more now than it would have a week ago. Before this argument, before either of them had named the thing that needed to change between them, it looks like the truth, told plainly. In a room full of people whose opinions Caroline's father actually cares about, Adrian said, Bradley pulled his investment out of your father's company to protect himself, and that decision contributed to his collapse. That's not speculation. It's documented in the filings. Easy enough to lay out clearly for anyone willing to look, and now he's trying to use a child, our child, as a bargaining chip to save himself a second time. People like Ashford care a great deal about appearances. Once the truth is in front of him, in a room full of his own peers, he won't want anything more to do with Bradley Coleman, marriage or otherwise. No threats, Elena said. No violence. I need you to promise me that. No threats. Adrian agreed. Just the truth, delivered where it will do the most damage to the only thing men like that actually fear losing, their reputation. I think you'll find that's often more effective than anything else. Together, Elena repeated, watching him carefully, testing whether the word carried the weight she needed it to carry now. Together, Adrian confirmed, and for the first time since they had returned from the gala days earlier, the word landed between them, not as a promise made under pressure, but as something steadier, something both of them had finally chosen on equal footing. It was barely an hour later, while Adrian sat across from her reviewing the early outline of how the evening might unfold, a notepad of names and timings scrawled in his careful, economical handwriting, that Elena felt the first sharp pull low across her abdomen, tight and unfamiliar, different from the small kicks and stretches she had grown used to over the past months. She pressed a hand against the spot instinctively, drawing a breath that came out shakier than she intended, and Adrian's head snapped up from his notes the instant he registered the change in her expression. Elena, I think, she said carefully, as another pull tightened across her middle, sharper this time. We might need to call the doctor sooner than next week. Adrian was beside her before she had fully finished the sentence, his earlier composure dissolving entirely into something more urgent, his hand finding hers as he reached for his phone with the other, already dialing the obstetrician's emergency line with the same swift, decisive precision he brought to every crisis. Except this time, his voice, when he spoke into the phone, carried none of the controlled calm she had come to associate with him in moments of danger. It carried instead the plain, unguarded fear of a man whose entire, carefully constructed world had just narrowed down to one single, urgent priority, and Elena, even through the discomfort tightening across her body, felt a small, unexpected warmth at the sight of it, the proof, undeniable now, that whatever else he was capable of, this fear was real, and it belonged entirely to her. The contractions, the doctor explained 2 hours later, were false labor, the body's natural rehearsal for what was still several weeks away, brought on most likely by stress and exhaustion rather than any sign of actual danger to the baby. Elena was instructed to rest, to keep her feet up, to avoid exactly the kind of confrontation that had marked the better part of her week, and Adrian, sitting beside her hospital bed, with her hand wrapped tightly in his, absorbed every word of the instruction with the grim focus of a man recalculating his entire plan for the coming days around a single, non-negotiable priority. "You're not coming to the gala," he said, the moment the doctor left the room, his tone leaving no space for argument. "I wasn't planning to argue that point," Elena said, surprising him. exhaustion settling heavily over her now that the adrenaline of the afternoon had finally drained away. I want this handled. I want it over. But I also want to actually be there to see our son born in a few weeks. Not lying in a hospital bed because I insisted on standing in a ballroom confronting people who already tried to use him as leverage once. Then we do this my way, Adrian said. But together, the way we agreed. I'll have a line open to you the entire evening. You'll see everything as it happens. You won't be in the room, but you won't be shut out of it either. She agreed, and the week that followed passed in a strange, suspended quiet. Elena confined largely to bed rest at Adrian's insistence. The security detail around her finally negotiated down to something she could live with. 2 careful, unobtrusive men rather than the small army that had surrounded her before. A compromise reached through actual conversation rather than unilateral decree. Adrian spent the days assembling the evidence he intended to present. Documentation of Bradley's withdrawal from Marchetti Logistics, pulled from public filings. A recorded account of the cafe conversation provided quietly by an employee who had recognized Bradley and alerted Adrian's people without being asked. And a carefully worded summary of the leverage scheme that left no room for misinterpretation once laid in front of the right eyes. He brought her drafts of the plan each evening, sitting on the edge of the bed while she read through them, asking her opinion before finalizing anything, a small ritual that meant more to Elena than he likely understood. The simple, repeated proof that the lesson from their argument had actually taken root rather than fading the moment the immediate crisis passed. By the 3rd evening, she found herself looking forward to the quiet hour they spent together going over the details. His careful, methodical mind laid open for her in a way it rarely was, and she understood, watching him cross out a line of his own plan because she had pointed out a flaw in it, that this was what he had meant by partnership, not a single grand gesture, but 100 small ones repeated until they became habit. The night of the Ashford Gala arrived with a kind of charged stillness Elena could feel even from the quiet of the estate's living room. Propped against a mountain of pillows with her phone propped on the table beside her. A live video call, open and waiting. Adrian appeared on the screen as he stepped from the car, impossibly composed in a black suit, the faint city lights of the venue glowing behind him. "Stay on the line," he said, his voice low. "I want you to see this." The ballroom, when the camera angle settled, was even grander than the Whitfield, a cavernous space dripping in white roses and crystal, the kind of old money excess that announced itself quietly rather than loudly. Elena watched through the screen as Adrian moved through the crowd with the same unhurried authority she had witnessed at the charity gala, conversation stalling and heads turning in his wake, until he found exactly who he was looking for near the center of the room. Bradley and Caroline standing beside her father, a silver-haired man with a kind of easy, practiced smile that belonged to someone who had spent his entire life being deferred to. "Mr. Ashford," Adrian said, his voice carrying easily across the small cluster of people nearby, pitched precisely to draw the attention of everyone who needed to hear it without quite shouting. "I wanted to thank you personally for the invitation, and to discuss the bellwether parcel, since I understand your future son-in-law has been quite invested in the negotiations." Caroline's father's smile flickered, uncertain. "Mr. Volkov, I wasn't aware Bradley had been in direct contact with you regarding that matter." "He hasn't," Adrian said. "Not directly. He's been working through a rather more creative approach. Perhaps you'd like to hear about it." He withdrew a folded set of documents from his jacket, handing them over with the unhurried calm of a man laying down a winning hand he had no doubt about. "These are the public filings showing Mr. Coleman's withdrawal of investment from Marchetti Logistics 18 months ago, a withdrawal that directly preceded the company's collapse and, shortly after, the death of its founder. And this," he continued, producing a second page, is a transcript of a conversation recorded 3 days ago, in which Mr. Coleman discussed using my unborn child as leverage to pressure me into favorable terms on Bellwether, an idea your daughter apparently first proposed. The color drained entirely from Caroline's face as her father's eyes moved across the transcript, his expression shifting from confusion into something cold and final. "Caroline," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the unmistakable weight of a man recalculating his entire family's social position in real time. "Is this true?" "Father, it isn't what it sounds like. I only meant to. It sounds exactly like what it is," Ashford said, cutting her off, folding the papers closed with the finality of a man already deciding what came next. He turned to Bradley, whose face had gone an unhealthy shade of pale. "Mr. Coleman, I believe our family's business arrangement, along with whatever understanding existed between you and my daughter, ends tonight." The ripple of the conversation spread through the room faster than Adrian had likely even anticipated. The particular hunger of high society for a fresh scandal, turning every nearby head toward the unfolding collapse. Conversations stalling mid-sentence as the news passed from one cluster of guests to the next, in the particular electric whisper reserved for the public undoing of people who had spent years carefully curating their reputations. Bradley stood frozen at the center of it, his mouth opening and closing without producing anything useful. The careful image he had built across years of strategic marriages and business alliances, dissolving in real time in front of the exact audience he had once hoped would secure his future. Elena, watching through the phone screen propped against her pillows, felt something settle deep and satisfied in her chest. Not vengeance exactly, but something close enough to it that she did not feel the need to examine the difference too closely. "That's everything," Adrian said quietly into the phone a few minutes later, having stepped away from the wreckage of Bradley's evening toward a quieter corner of the ballroom. "It's done. He won't be touching Bellwether. He won't be marrying into the Ashford fortune. And from the look of things, half this room already knows exactly what kind of man he turned out to be." "Come home," Elena said softly. "I think I've had enough of watching this happen from a screen." "On my way," Adrian said, and the warmth in his voice carried easily through the line, the controlled authority of moments earlier softening back into something only she ever got to see. 3 weeks later, in the early hours of a quiet morning, their son arrived after a labor that tested every careful plan Adrian had assembled for the occasion and rendered most of them irrelevant within the first hour, leaving him gripping Elena's hand at her bedside with an intensity that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the particular helplessness of loving someone through something he could not control or protect her from, only witness. He had prepared for nearly everything in the months leading up to this moment. Security routes and contingency plans and careful arrangements for every conceivable threat, and none of it had equipped him for the simple, overwhelming powerlessness of standing beside the woman he loved while she did something he could not do for her, could not negotiate away, could not shield her from, no matter how much of himself he was willing to spend trying. When the cries of their son finally filled the room, small and furious and impossibly alive, Adrian's composure broke entirely for the first time Elena had ever seen, tears slipping unguarded down his face as the nurse placed the baby in his arms. He stood very still for a long moment, looking down at the small, red, furious face of his son with an expression Elena had never once witnessed in him before, not in any boardroom, not in any negotiation, not even in the quiet privacy of their own home. Something that looked almost like disbelief, as though some part of him had genuinely doubted, until this exact instant, that a life like his could ever produce something this entirely uncomplicated and good. He sat beside her bed afterward, their son sleeping against his chest, and looked at Elena with an expression stripped of every careful calculation she had ever seen him wear in any boardroom or ballroom. "I used to think the only way to keep someone safe was to control everything around them," he said quietly, his thumb tracing gently along the curve of their son's small hand. "You taught me a better way." He's never going to grow up thinking love means being afraid, or being managed, or being kept in a cage built out of someone else's fear. He's going to grow up knowing exactly what real protection looks like, because his mother showed me how to give it properly. "And what does that look like?" Elena asked softly. Watching the two of them with a fullness in her chest, she had once believed herself incapable of feeling again. "Like this," Adrian said simply, leaning forward to press a gentle kiss to her forehead, then to the soft curve of their son's head. "Exactly like this." Outside the window, the city carried on the way it always did, indifferent to the small, quiet miracle unfolding in the room above it, and Elena let herself rest against the pillows, her husband and her son both within reach, and understood, with a certainty that finally felt unshakable, that whatever name people whispered about Adrian Volkov in the rooms she would never see, in this room, in this life they had built together out of honesty rather than control. He was simply hers, and she was simply his. And their son would never once have to wonder whether he was loved enough to be protected, or protected enough to be loved. He would only ever have to know that he was both, completely, without condition. For as long as either of them drew breath, true protection is never the same thing as control. Adrian loved Elena enough to surround her with walls before he ever loved her enough to ask whether she wanted to live behind them, and it took an honest, uncomfortable conversation, not a grand romantic gesture, to teach him the difference. Real safety is built with someone, never imposed on them, no matter how good the intentions behind it. Elena's story is also a reminder that other people's cruelty often says more about their own desperation than it ever says about your worth. Bradley mocked a body he didn't understand because his own world was already collapsing. And the people who hurt you publicly are rarely as powerful as they need you to believe in that moment. Carry your own truth quietly until you're ready to set it down on your own terms, the way Elena did, and let it speak louder than anything they said first. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss what's coming next. Drop a comment below. Would you have confronted Bradley yourself, the way Elena did, or called for backup first? Let me know which chapter hit you hardest. And don't forget to share this with someone who needs a reminder that the people who once made them feel small were never actually as powerful as they seemed. See you in the next story.